order. Kevin Hollingworth to move the motion.
Thank you, Dame Siobhan. It's a pleasure to hold this debate with you in the chair, and I beg to move that this House has considered the adequacy of planning policy for travellers' sites. Now, my constituents are very reasonable people. They totally understand and appreciate people's wanting to live different ways of life, alternative ways of life, including nomadic lifestyles, and certainly in my constituency where I've lived all my life, the travelling community has been part of that constituency for that whole period of time, and we very much respect them, the contribution they make to our society. Of course, as long as, of course, the communities are law-binding and let other people go about have the peaceful enjoyment of their property and their settlements and communities. What their concern is, and the real concerns in my constituency about a number of different planning applications, is that the planning policies apply equally to local people as to other communities, including travelling communities. The basic principle that there is one law for all of us, rather than one law for one person, another for another person, and that the law applies equally to everyone in our communities and our society. And I think there's a real feeling in some of these applications that that is not the case. And it contributes to the feeling, perhaps in our society is moving to a form of two-tier society, and that would be a very, very dangerous state of affairs. I think it's fair to say, in some of the communities where these applications are being made, that our local communities don't understand why it is that planning policy is not overseen equally, and indeed a deal of anger about that particular situation. So we've got a number of applications, one at Sheriff Hutton in my constituency, one near Rillington, and a number of potential other ones where these situations are occurring. And these applications are being considered and in some cases recommended for approval on the basis of not planning law, but other laws, such as the Human Rights Act, Equalities Act, and UN Convention for the Rights of the Child, and indeed the European Convention of Human Rights, which obviously is having other consequences in different parts of our system. So normal law-abiding citizens go about a planning application in the appropriate way. The first thing they do is find a site that may suit their needs, of course. Then look at planning policy and probably instruct an agent to look after that on their behalf. Submit an application before doing any work to that site. But submit an application that must conform to planning policy, otherwise they will not get consent for that application, and go through the various iterations that a planning process takes, which may take years to get that planning consent, and hopefully at some point through that process they get consent for the property development they're looking to do. So most of my constituents respect the planning process and the outcomes of that process. Very happy to give way to my honourable friend.
Madam Chair, can I first of all apologise to you, Madam Chair, and to the honourable gentleman as well. I can't stay of other engagements and try and fit them all in. I apologise for that, but I did wish to speak in this. Does the honourable member agree that we need to ensure that all policies that pertain to allowing travellers to carry on their way of life without adversely affecting the community around them, and this very delicate balance that has to be struck is not simply in planning policy alone, but also in all policies. We want, I believe, the foster traveller communities that feel engaged and a part of our communities. And I do believe that this can be achieved by building relationships and just with a little bit of understanding. Does he agree?
Yeah, as always, he is very reasonable, and I think that's exactly the position my constituents take, and I take. It's about fairness, but also applying the law equally. And that's looking at the Human Rights Act, there is a requirement to treat, not just consider the rights of the individual, but the rights of other people in that situation. And that's very clear, but it seems to be that some of these applications are being considered, giving the applicants giving greater consideration than the rights of others. And that's my biggest concern. I mean, this has been dealt with to some extent through planning policy, but I don't think sufficiently to deal with some of these problems we are seeing. So I set out how a law-abiding, somebody who respects the law and the planning process might set about applying for planning permission. What is happening in some of these applications is not being done that way around. What's happening is some of these applicants are purchasing a site, first of all, probably a roadside site, with access or without access, creating an access, and these sites are, this site in Sheriff Hutton and in Rillington is in open countryside, is not in a location you would normally get planning consent for this kind of development. What happens then is the site is prepared, the access, hard standing, for example, which is not a major contravention of planning policy, not something the planning department may have too big a problem with at that point in time. There may be an agricultural building on that site, for example, and there may be water and power put into this site. A preparation occurs. And then one evening, overnight, or at a bank holiday weekend, when the people who are supposed to look after these matters may not be in their office, that site is occupied without planning consent in a way that is unlawful. So it may be caravans move onto that site, other equipment, maybe toilet blocks are built overnight. This is certainly what happened on one of the sites, and that site is occupied with a view to that site being occupied permanently. This is not a temporary position. The people who are occupying that site intend to occupy it permanently. Of course, then, the planning authority has to go through an enforcement process, one that's happened. We've got local complaints from local people about the application, and then the planning authority will, the wheels turn pretty slowly, which I think the people who are occupying the site are aware of that, and enforcement measures are taking place. And this may take a matter of months, of course, and which then, say, the community may have experienced some disturbance and some real concerns are expressed by local communities at that point in time. When enforcement measures take place, the occupant of that land, the owner of that land, will then submit an application, a planning application, retrospectively. Despite there being a flagrant breach of proper planning process, that application is then considered as if it was, if the application was made using the proper process. And I think that's fundamentally what goes wrong here. The fact that the retrospective application is considered on the same grounds as if it was a normal, lawful process, that is what is wrong. And when the application is made, of course, the application is made on the basis of the rights of the people occupying that site. So often the Human Rights Act is quoted, the Equality Act of 2010 is quoted, the UN Convention of the Child, the European Convention of Human Rights, all these things are quoted for the rights of the occupants, generally the families of that particular site. And their needs, of course, things like healthcare and education. And no one would doubt the needs of the children on those sites, for example, or people in need of healthcare, accessing those kind of facilities. But those are all the basis of the application, why this application should be considered, despite the fact it is retrospective. Yes, of course.
First of all, Madam Chair, can I thank Jennifer for being so gracious and for giving a second intervention. Is he aware of the latest Irish Travellers Accommodation Strategy 2020-2025? If the Honourable Member isn't, or the Minister isn't, could I suggest that perhaps maybe access should be made for that? Because it does, I think, set out guidelines to provide Irish travellers, in this case, with access to good quality, culturally appropriate housing accommodation which fosters a sustainable, vibrant travelling community. That allows the travellers to enjoy their own lifestyle, but at the same time consider the possibility of integration. Does he agree that perhaps that guideline, which is from a different jurisdiction, but the guidelines may be helpful?
Kevin Holland-Wake.
Well, perhaps understandably, this is not actually my policy area. I'm certainly holding this debate on the basis that it's a particular constituency issue, but so I'm not particularly aware of the Irish rules in terms of those he quotes. But it's absolutely right to say that local planning authorities have a requirement to facilitate the peaceful enjoyment of people who live nomadic lifestyles, and I support that totally. And North Yorkshire should provide those kind of facilities, and they do. This site is occupied despite the fact there are available places on a specified, designated traveller site nearby, and that's one of the concerns. There are other facilities available, yet this particular application is based upon somebody who doesn't want to be on that site and wants to be somewhere else, and then I believe is misusing the planning policy in the right. That's my point about this. Not people. I'm not have any objection to people's right to live alternative lifestyles and to live in different ways and in their own communities. What I object to is misuse of the planning process. Now, this was dealt with to some extent by my very fine colleague and sadly late colleague James Brokenshire back in when he was Housing Secretary. Back in February 2019, he published some new recommendations to planning authorities which did say that the intentional, unauthorised development of a site should be considered as a material point within a planning application, which I think this is absolutely critical. He was saying, therefore, that that should give a local planning authority grounds to refuse an application on the basis that this, there was an intentional, unauthorised development. So I think that's critical. The issue with this, of course, despite that requirement, and despite North Yorkshire, the local planning authority being aware of that requirement, still, on this site, recommended approval, which I find astounding. So, and I find this whole situation astounding, and so do many of my constituents. And, you know, I think it's very important we look at the facts and people engaged in this debate, or people perhaps watching this on Parliament TV, can look at this particular application if they go to the North Yorkshire portal. Number 22-00102 FUL is the planning reference. But all this, everything I'm saying here is not based upon just local rumours, local concerns, all about the actual documented situation with this planning application. The particular site in question, that site, is on Cornborough Road off Sheriff Hutton. It's about half a mile out of the village of Sheriff Hutton. It is in open countryside. It is outside the development plan. The application is for 8 units of accommodation, 4 permanent units, probably brick-built units or breeze block-built units, as well as permanent static caravans on that site, and also 12 car spaces. It's been occupied now for 3 years without planning consent. A family with 6 children, and obviously we respect the rights of that family to go about their lives in a way they would feel appropriate, and we have every hope those children will be properly educated and receive proper public services. But the planning authority, in their wisdom, the planning officers, decided to recommend for approval this particular site. They made one condition on that, one significant condition, is that occupancy of the site was to be restricted to the family and their dependents. So both the adults on that site, the owners of the site, and their children. And of course, those children could be adults one day, and that would mean that site could be occupied for many decades, of course. And also, as it says in the application, there could be a variation of application to for an extended family, for example, or other variation, which could mean that site would be occupied for a very, very, very long time. Interestingly, remarkably, I think, the agent for the applicant, upon that, objected to that condition, again on human rights grounds. So it's very clear this site will be occupied permanently in the very long term, and have the ability to sell this site on to someone else. I think that's absolutely wrong, that you can effectively drive a coach and horses through the planning system. My constituents, my law-abiding constituents, would not go about it in that way. And I think unless we deal with this properly, this will breed that sense of unfairness, and there are factors, a law for one and a law for another. I think unless we deal with this to make sure that anybody who is guilty of a flagrant abuse of the planning system cannot ever get planning consent on a site in this way, unless we clarify the planning guidance around that particular measure, I think we will see more and more of these applications, not just in my constituency, but in constituencies around the country. And I think I really urge the Minister, and I know he's freshly into his job, and I welcome him to his place. He's a very good man. We've dealt with many things in the past when our roles are reversed. So I know he'll look at this very seriously. We've engaged on this particular matter already, as I have my colleague, the Shadow Minister, who again is a great experience in these matters. But I really think we need to tighten the rules here to make sure our constituents, the citizens, the law-abiding citizens of this country feel we're on their side, the side of the law-abiding people who go about the process properly, and we don't favour people because of quite abstract laws or laws that potentially imposed upon us by the UN Convention of the Child or European Convention of Human Rights, which is now embedded within our own Human Rights Act. That means some people are treated more fairly than others through the process. I think it's very important we act and very important we clarify the planning process so people who act in this way can never get planning consent, because that is the only way we'll stop these kind of applications, these rogue applications, being submitted. Thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. The question is that this House has considered the adequacy of planning policy for Travellers' Site. Olivia Blake.
Chairship, Dame Siobhan. And I'd like to thank the member for bringing forward the debate, and I'm sure it is a subject that many members are familiar with. Sadly, I think the familiarity does not always come from a good place. Often it is driven by casework, and my understanding of these issues has been enriched by listening to the traveller community within my own constituency and hearing about the problems that they have experienced. I have heard the concerns about a two-tier system when it comes to planning, but it was interesting to discuss on a long-standing site that's council-run in my area that they are not eligible for right to buy, for example, even though some of those families have lived there for 40-plus years. And the idea that there is a two-tier system in planning kind of ignores the fact that there is also a two-tier system for this very prejudiced against group of people. But too often our familiarity also comes with lurid headlines, which often generate a lot of heat rather than shedding light on the problem experienced by the community facing discrimination and disadvantage across the board. I think that's important to bear in mind when we talk about this issue within the context of the planning system, and that we're honest about the context of these problems. It is very difficult to have a sensible discussion about how we best serve GRT communities when words like incursion are used, or when groups of travellers are repeatedly characterised as ruining picturesque landscapes, towns, villages, or creating nuisance and disturbance, or somehow being above the rules. Because of that context, we need to be explicit and say that far from the invalidation and demonisation of these communities that we often see in the media, the planning system should support this group to live in the way that they choose. I think there has been an absolute failure in providing adequate sites for those that do travel, and stopping places have just simply not been available. So it's no wonder that families are looking for alternatives. And that, unfortunately, means that there is a huge shortage of sites and pitches across the UK, and in England in particular. And as a result, the Friends, Family and Traveller Organisation reports that in 2019, 13% of caravans were on unauthorised land. What we're seeing isn't an incursion, it's rather a forced displacement, with there being a lack of available sites for those who choosing to travel.
Thank you for giving way. I absolutely agree with what she says, that the sites should be made available. Can I just reiterate the point, and the particular ones I've raised here, are sites available for this family. In fact, this family occupied a site in Tower Road in Malton until they moved on to this particular site. So it is not the case. There are no sites available, and there are nearby sites in Oswald, in York as well. So it's very important to understand this is not as if there are no alternatives other than occupying unlawfully this site.
Olivia Blake.
This is where I think that it's really important that local authorities do work with the community to understand their needs. There are many reasons why individual families may not feel able to be on a site, and also they may want to create their own space and home, which I completely understand as well. And I think rather than create more sites, we did see a move in the previous government to criminalise GRT communities through the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act, and these laws should be repealed in my view, and we should be tackling the root cause of the issue, the failure of the system to support a diverse group of people who already suffer prejudice and discrimination. And there is a lack of understanding, I think, about the realities of this group. But it is not just that we need new sites and more pitches, it is also that the ones we have are not up to scratch. That's certainly true in the sites that are in my constituency. And they are often segregated from settled communities and suffer problems such as access to services, transport and schools. For example, there is no path that reaches to the community that I represent, and that means that children are having to walk down a 60-mile-per-hour road to get the bus to school. Also, when the street lights were updated, for some reason the contractor didn't realise that the council owned the properties, so they've been living with poor quality street lighting rather than LED street lighting, something that I'm hoping will soon be resolved on that site. And, you know, this is the kind of suffering that we see in these communities. They're often seen as other, difficult to deal with. I don't think that's true in my experience, and I think actually if we listen to the concerns of the community, that is where we see progress, and that is where we can see clarity of responsibility, not only from the community itself, but from the services that are meant to serve them. And I think it's really important that to note that some of the decisions around where sites should be placed are often in unsafe areas, for example, next to main roads, next to refuse destructors, traffic-laden areas, intersections of motorways, busy highways and railway tracks. There's many reasons you might not want your children to be near those, and that has contributed significantly to the health, education and other social inequalities that we see in the community. And part of the reason for the segregation and isolation is because of political pressure. I think we have to acknowledge that, and that we know that local authorities haven't been achieving what they should be in terms of sites and options and working with the community as best they can. And that's why this isn't just a technical debate on planning laws. We have to talk about tackling attitudes as well. And when the Caravan Sites Act was passed in 1968, councils were given a statutory duty to create sites. Many people opposed having them in their area. And to put it bluntly, the location of many sites today is the consequence of an anti-traveller racism. You know, certainly the site in my area is right on the edge of town, away from many, many services. So yes, we need more sites and pitches, and we need to end the criminalisation of people living in a legitimate way. But we also need to work with the community and listen to their needs and understand that actually, you know, they are individual people and they have individual rights, as we all do. I know that the member probably disagrees about those rights in terms of the European human rights, as he kind of alluded to, being seen as kind of putting one group ahead of another. I disagree with that. I think that those rights protect us all and allow us all to have those individual rights and freedoms that we so richly deserve. Absolutely.
I agree with the principle, and that's how the Human Rights, the Human Convention on Human Rights is framed, and the Human Rights Act is framed. My point is that's not how it's operating in practice. In practice, my constituents cannot occupy a field and build a house there if it's outside, if it's in open countryside and not within the development limits of a village. They operate on that basis. Why is it that somebody else from a different community should be able to do this and occupy that site and develop it in a way that my other constituents who work on a lawful basis do not? Why should that be the case?
I think he's highlighting an important issue for his constituency, and I think that does point to the failure in this space, and I think that's not something that I'm disagreeing with, but I do think that we have to recognise that the reason these rights come to the fore is because of that failure, not the other way round. And I think that that's something that we really need to focus on in our policies going forward when it comes to planning, that we do need to, again, communicate with the community and work with them to understand their needs and make sure that those needs are being met adequately, and also not hold it against communities that have bought their own land, for example, but work with them to make sure that they can adequately go through the planning process for their community needs and for their family needs. But we also need to have a better integration within communities, amenities and services, and we need to end the criminalisation, as I've said, and to do that we need to challenge anti-GRT attitudes and the lurid headlines that drive them. That would be a good start to ensuring that the planning system works for this community. I don't disagree that the planning system is broken, but I think that there is certainly a better way into this conversation that starts with an understanding of all our communities, not just one or the other. Thank you, Chair.
Dean.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. This is an issue which, sadly, is one which creates perennial problems in communities up and down the country, and we never seem to be able to fix. In my previous career as a journalist, I very often had to travel to areas where there was tension between local residents and traveller groups, because they had been established in a site which was inappropriate, wasn't legally designated, there wasn't planning permission for it, and the local residents felt that it was inappropriate, their lives were being disturbed, that the behaviour was not what they were used to, they did not like, and it still happens. Only this summer we had an issue in my constituency in Edinburgh West of a travelling community who parked close to a local community centre, and that caused a great deal of concern in the local community, and it caused tension, and it was unfair to both. It was unfair to the travellers because there was no designated site nearby. There is an insufficiency of sites up and down the country, and the local residents had to put up with behaviour that made them extremely unhappy, caused them distress. It was the travellers' way of life which they didn't understand, and that is not good enough. Neither community is right, neither community is wrong. And I feel that they often blame politicians for failing to grasp the problem. And frankly, I think they've got a point. We do fail to grasp the problem. Now, as has already been mentioned by the Honourable Member, the Equality and Human Rights Commission recognised Gypsy and Irish traveller communities as a distinct ethnic group protected under the Equality Act of 2010. But here we are, 2024, and nothing seems to have changed. So is it enough? And part of me, as I said, doesn't blame communities for being distressed and travellers for being frustrated, because it does seem like it's a hot potato, which is just that fraction too hot for us to grasp. We would much rather just push it to one side. And what that means is that nothing gets done until, like in my constituency this summer, there are problems and there are tension. There were complaints about animals, the way they were being treated, about human waste, about fly tipping, illegal parking. And then action was taken. But nothing was done beforehand. And that shouldn't be the case. There is a problem, as I said, with the alternative designated sites. And the only option does seem to be wait, and it's not good enough. In Scotland, there is no specific piece of legislation which protects the ability and right to live a travelling lifestyle. Yes, local authorities do have powers to move communities on, but only when they have parked somewhere without the consent of the owner, under the Trespass Scotland Act, or the Refuse Disposal Amenity Act, or the Road Traffic Act, or the Criminal Justice Act. But there is no specific legislative framework. There is no specific planning permission framework which enables communities in areas to feel that their rights will be protected, that their way of life will be protected, or that the travellers feel that their way of life is protected as it is supposed to be under the Equalities Act. So what is the solution? I've heard about the problems in England, and they are slightly different in Scotland. And England councils, as I understand it, have to identify sites, but there are no consequences for the councils if they don't. That's why I do believe that what we need is concerted action by both the government in Holyrood, where appropriate, and in Westminster, to ensure that local authorities have the resources, the backing, the legislative framework to provide the network of suitable, legally designated sites across the UK, which would provide facilities in appropriate places for the travelling community to live the lifestyle which is protected under legislation, and for local residents to feel that they were protected from travellers arriving and parking in an inappropriate place because there is no alternative. And it's time we stopped beating about the bush and we stopped saying, oh, well, we won't deal with it just now and we'll deal with it next summer. The first time I covered this story as a journalist was more than 30 years ago now. Very little has changed. And neither community feels in any way that the situation has been improved for them. And it's time that our government's acted to do something about it. Thank you.
Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I congratulate the honourable member for securing this very important debate. He spoke about a two-tier society. He spoke about one law for all of us. He spoke about being on their side, and I quote, he spoke about being on the side of the law-abiding community. And you know, I seek a one-tier society, frankly. I represent all citizens, as we all do in this House, and I should declare an interest as a serving borough councillor at Rugby Borough Council. And I have had it confirmed by officers, and I think we're all aware of the fact that all citizens, including the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community, have an equal right to their housing needs being met, equal to every other group within society, every other citizen. I think we should reflect on that. Now, I just want to reflect briefly on a case that I was involved in, and it talks to some of the issues that have been raised by other honourable members in this debate so far this morning. In the case that was before the Planning Committee that I served on, the applications came before the committee. I believe there were 6 of them on a site in my constituency, and they were rejected by the Planning Committee. But the context was absolutely critical. Rugby Borough Council had not met its obligations around providing sufficient pitches for the Gypsy, Roma and Traveller community. They have a statutory obligation to do the surveys and ultimately to provide those pitches. They have failed to do that over many, many years. They have tried calls for sites, as I'm sure colleagues will be aware of, and these resulted in no sites being offered by local landowners. As I said, applications then come in, and the honourable member referred to the case that in his constituency, and I appreciate that he said that there are proper sites available, and I accept that point. But in this case, there were not. And so, of course, inevitably the local community was very exercised and angry about these applications. The local then Conservative-run council, which had a majority on the planning committee, rejected those applications. And then I would argue that the rights of those citizens were not respected. So their rights to housing were not respected, and their additional rights that have been referred to by other members were also not met. In a sense, they became second-class citizens. So I believe that local authorities, such as the one that I still serve as a councillor on, need to be encouraged, and I'd be very interested to hear my honourable friend's views on this, encouraged, strongly encouraged, required even, to finally provide the proper sites for the Gypsy and Roma and traveller community that they need. These sites need to be near to amenities and services, whether educational, transport, etc. And they need to be provided, because if they're not, then the situations that I experienced as a member of that planning committee and as the honourable member has experienced will keep reoccurring, and the two communities will continually be in a state of conflict, which is bad for everybody. Finally, let's listen to the Gypsy, Roma and traveller community. Let's listen to them. Let's do things that are in accordance with their needs. Let's not just do things to them, almost as if they were people who can just be dumped in particular sites because of the inconvenience of providing them with proper facilities and places to live. Let's treat them with dignity. And let's also listen to the settled community, whose needs and views are very important as well. Let's do everything we can to bring communities together, but that simply will not be possible until local authorities, backed by, I hope, the government, provide the pitches and the places that the GRT community can live with dignity and live within our community and live within communities around this country that we as members in this House represent equally. Thank you.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I thank the honourable member for Thirsk and Moulton for securing this important debate. We need to have a planning system that both respects the rights of the traveller community, but that provides local authorities with the power to support good development while being able to enforce their planning policy. I myself have seen this, having served as a district councillor for 10 years and leader of district council for 5 years, the difficulties in both securing adequate sites but also the integration of traveller communities within the areas where they're looking to settle. I welcome the steps that the previous government took to improve the last government, to strengthen the planning system, including passing the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act 2023, which extended the period during which enforcement action can be taken against unauthorised development to 10 years in all cases. And I commend the last government, which also brought in the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Act 2022, which strengthens powers available to the police to tackle unauthorised encampments which cause damage, disruption or distress. However, as the member for Thirsk and Moulton has outlined, there are many examples across the country where the careful balance between travellers and local communities and the environment appears to be incorrect. As a Member of Parliament, I do not intend to comment on routine planning applications, as it is a matter for Bromsgrove District Council. There is, however, currently an ongoing application that perfectly highlights many of the challenges associated with planning applications for traveller sites. There's a particular case in my constituency involving a site where travellers have bought land and moved onto a rural greenfield site, a piece of land that has been long designated as amenity land and then retrospectively applied for planning permission. The local community are against the proposal, with both local and nearby parish councils having raised serious concerns about the suitability of the site, including poor and dangerous road access to the site, the loss of biodiversity, significant impact on a public right-of-way that runs through the land where local residents are currently being harassed with antisocial behaviour, unable to follow their usual route through this long-standing public right-of-way. But more importantly, and considerably to the worry of my constituents, is a very large upswing in rural crime that's taken place in recent months. And this started in a minor fashion with the theft of chickens from a farm. We've seen theft of items from gardens. We've seen massive surge in general antisocial behaviour and abuse to local residents, as well as the emergence of some much more significant elements of crime. As a result of this, I've engaged with local police and local residents to try and tackle that specific issue. But of course, the nub of this, in many ways, comes back to the fact that a piece of land has been bought and there is effectively a change of use application that's being submitted, and there is a concern amongst residents that the system and public agencies often pass the buck. This case has been stuck in the planning process for many months now, and the delay in any decision is causing significant further uncertainty, and there is an emergence of community tension that's appearing. So it's really clear to me that the system as it currently stands is not working for any of the parties involved. And when I say that the system is not working for any of the parties involved, that is in this specific case. I want to put on record that I know there are thousands of traveller communities across the country that are law-abiding, that want to identify plots of land that they can occupy with their families and wider communities where they want to integrate in the areas where they are looking to settle. I was elected chair on a mandate to protect the greenbelt across Bromsgrove, and my constituency is formally 89% greenbelt. And I am deeply concerned at the prospect of losing greenbelt that gives Bromsgrove its rural identity, and that includes greenfield sites of the kind that I've already described. And I fail to see how permitting unplanned traveller sites on the greenbelt will do anything to protect the identity and the cohesion of the rural communities that exist there at the moment. It's already been noted by honourable members that these sites are often far away from local services. They become car-dependent settlements. There are often a lack of footways. There's a lack of nearby schools. This is a really important topic that I saw during my tenure as leader of Wychavon District Council, that many of these traveller families, they have children. They need to go to school. They want their children to be able to go to schools. Yet, there's already often a lack of local provision, and this is again putting an unsustainable strain on services and local amenities across our communities. And that creates an isolation where these communities, which are already remote from the services that they access, they may have a different sort of social or economic identification relative to the areas where they're looking to settle. And this is all exacerbated by the current broken planning system. And so the planning system needs to work better with local police and other services to allow for a coherent public response, rather than having, it seems to residents, different public agencies, all sort of, as I've mentioned already, passing the buck between one another, no one able to get clear answers as to where the responsibility lies for tackling the different pressures that arise from the emergence of traveller sites that often, outside of the conventional planning process, where sites are identified, these problems emerge when new sites are bought and a retrospective planning application is put in. These current regulations around these sites don't seem to support a culture where permission is sought. Instead, quite often appears to be a culture where an action is taken and it's more a sentiment of forgiveness being sought rather than going through the usual process that the vast majority of law-abiding citizens follow, one where we do our due diligence, put in a planning application, allow for communities and those affected to submit their comments in the usual way and go through the proper planning process. And that's the piece that I think frustrates my constituents the most, Chair, that they go about their life in a law-abiding fashion. If they want to put an extension on their property, they will apply for planning permission in the usual way, if it's not subject to permitted development already. And there is a general feeling that there are a small number, and I will stress small number, of traveller communities that appear to ride roughshod over the system. And that's then to the detriment of not just the communities where communities which are affected, but it really sort of undermines the integrity of the planning system as a whole. So the planning system needs to work better across the board, and public agencies, we need to have a much more joined-up response in how we tackle this, particularly the impact of antisocial behaviour and particularly rural crime. Residents and developers must carefully work within greenbelt policy in the same way that traveller communities must. We must get away from this perception that, whether it's because of a retrospective application or just a general disregard for planning policy, or even more broadly, maybe a disregard for the law, that people are able to queue jump whilst providing some of the worst forms of development. I sincerely hope, Chair, that as the government review planning policy over the coming months, they will closely look at all of these issues and ensure that we have a system that promotes good development in the interests not just of existing communities, but those who are looking, those traveller communities that are looking to integrate and settle into our existing, quite often rural communities.
Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Dame MacDonald. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I thank the Honourable Member for Thirsk Moulton for bringing forward this important debate. Now, I've listened carefully to the other Honourable Members that have spoken today, and I appreciate that there, in some cases, there is a misuse of planning, and it's clear that we do need the system to work better, to tackle those attitudes. I appreciate the member for Sheffield Hallam who said that it's often seen as it's difficult to deal with, but it shouldn't be the case, and we need to ensure that placing of the sites are in the right place to avoid segregation and isolation. My honourable friend for Edinburgh West spoke passionately about how we have simply not progressed. Neither community feel represented, and we must seek to change this. The Honourable Member for Rugby spoke about the risk of the GRT community becoming second-class citizens, and that we must again find those appropriate sites to stop that reoccurrence of conflicts. Let's engage and listen to the GRT community, treat them with respect and dignity. And the Honourable Member for Bromsgrove, who raised his concerns about agencies passing the buck and the emergence of those tensions, which I think all of us share. Now, in the space of a month, I have received correspondence about illegal traveller sites from concerned constituents in Wincanton and Glastonbury. These towns are at the opposite ends of my constituency, and the complaints that are coming from them are a symptom of the fact that Somerset, like most in the country, is facing some huge challenges with properly supporting our GRT communities. Friends, families and travellers, a national charity, received a response to their engagement campaign this summer that called for an increase of site provision for Nobanic people, transient and permanent. Now, I don't know if that respondent lives in Somerset, but I would not be surprised. Somerset has no transit provisions, none at all. Members of the Gypsy and traveller community, like all of us, have to travel across the country to attend funerals, weddings and to see family. But because we have no transit sites and therefore nowhere for them to legally stay for short periods, the only way that they can stop when passing through our sizable county in Somerset is in the form of an unauthorised encampment. You would only need to look at my casework to see that these encampments and travellers' encampments inflame tensions between my constituents and travellers, some of whom are, of course, my constituents, and that they reinforce dangerous stereotypes. Now, unfortunately, we are not alone. 91% of English local authorities have some form of GRT presence. So it's alarming to see that this is a growing trend nationally, either because local authorities are selling off sites or they're simply unable to afford to maintain them. Now, I worry that we could soon find ourselves in a situation where there are huge distances between these transit sites, which would make it impossible for travellers to legally travel. It also harms our relationship with the GRT community, because the only response that local authorities are then left with is enforcement. This isn't just transit sites that we need more of. We also need permanent pitches where members of the GRT community can stay longer than just 3 months. Now, there are well-known, documented and dangerous knock-on effects to the effects of not providing this community with stability. Whilst the community is naturally transient, they need access to a permanent base. Without a permanent pitch or a brick and mortar address, it can be a struggle to access mental health support and GP appointments, which forces more people to use our overburdened accident and emergency services to access healthcare. It's tragic, but not surprising, that members of the GRT community have life expectations that are 10 to 25 years less than the general population, and that the suicide rate for traveller men is 7 times higher than for settled men. We also know that it leads to reduced attainment rates for those in education, with only 18% of GRT communities meeting the expected standard in their SATs exams last year. Councils could avoid huge additional costs if they didn't have to waste officer time dealing with complaints and cleaning up encampments. The case for providing these permanent pitches is clear, and local authorities have a quota for delivering traveller provision, but there is nowhere for them to obtain funding. Funding has recently taken the form of ad hoc grants that are too small and oversubscribed. If we expect local authorities to be able to maintain a constant and consistent number of sites, we must provide them with consistent and adequate funding. The Liberal Democrat manifesto pledged to ensure that all development has appropriate infrastructure, services and amenities in place by integrating infrastructure and public service delivery into the planning process. This should also include the development of permanent pitches. Now, I was recently elected as the Vice Chair for the Gypsy, Traveller and Roma APPG, an APPG that wrote to the then government in the last Parliament to urge them to increase site provision. That government failed to deliver sites, but the new government could. The Liberal Democrats have a strong record of supporting GRT community, but we want to work with colleagues to bring about an end to these systemic problems. The King's speech confirmed that this government... I will give way.
Very valid and interesting point. But she seems to think it was the central government's responsibility to provide traveller sites. I think that's what she said. No. Okay, I've misunderstood that. Perhaps you'll clarify. But she accepts it is the local planning authority's responsibility to provide these sites.
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. He misunderstands. I'm fully aware that it's the local authorities that provide traveller sites, but the funding isn't there for them to provide it. And that is my case, that over and over again, as we know, many local authorities are on the brink. They are under such pressure at the moment. The fact that they aren't able to provide the resources within their remit is the crucial point here, and that is what was lacking in the last Parliament, and that is what we need to see from this new government to ensure that local authorities have the resources and the capabilities that they need to provide sites for our traveller community. So, as I was saying in the King's speech, it was confirmed that this government intends on reforming our planning system, and when they do so, they must not treat the gypsy and traveller provision as an afterthought to the bricks and mortar housing. Looking after this community is a housing requirement, not an add-on that can be addressed when there is more time and more money. I would like to see this government introduce a statutory duty to provide sites along proper funding measures. With a reasonable approach to both location and funding, this could be the single biggest transformative measure for gypsies and travellers in England. Our planning regulations and guidance are not fit to serve the community. The guidance dictates that what local authorities need to deliver within a site, but it is not properly delivering provisions at the moment, which then leads the GRT community being viewed negatively and the community feel less safe. The government should make updating these documents a priority. And finally, not all of these problems can be solved with reforms or an increase in funding. The narrative from the previous government was not constructive, and it made it challenging for local authorities to build meaningful dialogue. In the last decade, Somerset and much of the rest of the country has seen a reduction in publicly owned sites, less community liaison officer roles in local authorities, and a lack of new private sites. An increase in unauthorised encampments and a reduction in funding for site development, and a political inertia slowing down pitch development. We need this new government to provide real leadership and to ensure that the needs of the Gypsy, Roma and traveller community are met. We should engage and treat our Gypsy, Roma and traveller community with respect and dignity and provide them with the sites that they need to live their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dame Siobhan. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I congratulate the member for Thirsk and Malton in securing this debate on an issue which the contributions of all members have helped to illustrate both its complexity and also its importance at a community level. Every local authority has a quasi-judicial role as a planning authority, and in that it has to follow planning law and the statutes that apply to that. I'd like to be very clear from the contribution of the member for Thirsk and Malton and other members who've highlighted this particular aspect, that the call that they are making is that everyone should be treated as equal before the law for the purposes of the planning process. And clearly for our local authorities, that is a complex challenge because they also have various statutory duties as housing providers. So a local authority may face the challenge where it has to ensure that planning law is fully upheld when considering an application, but it also has a role to designate sites on which traveller pitches and other development may take place. And most of us will have experience. I do at Jackets Lane in my constituency, almost identical situation to the one described by the member for Thirsk and Malton. And I'm fortunate, as many members are, to have two local authorities that have both full housing revenue account, local authority maintained traveller pitches, and also privately designated sites which are available. But it is understandable for the reasons which are outlined by the member for Wychavon and which I've personally experienced in my own home, when we know that there are some aspects of the behaviour of individuals associated with these sites that cause a great deal of community concern. And it is important, in my view, to recognise that we simply cannot say that the Gypsy Roma traveller community is one community. I know in my own constituency there are settled travellers who've chosen a place to occupy a bricks and mortar home and who may have a requirement for family members who are travelling to be able to come and stay close to them at certain times of year. There are people with much more ancient lifestyles, particularly amongst some of the Roma and traditional Gypsy community, whose requirement is very different. And we need to ensure that all of our local authorities have the flexibility and communities have the awareness to understand what the distinctions are so that the responses that we put in place are appropriate. But we all accept that ultimately, for some individuals, there will be an inadequacy of provision, that there maybe isn't a spot on the local authority provided site when they arrive, and indeed the behaviour of some who may not even be UK residents, but who can arrive in large numbers and undertake unlawful and illegal incursions, can significantly affect the reputation of the wider members of the Gypsy, Roma and traveller community. But the member for Thirsk and Malton asks a very important question in the context of parliamentary proceedings, which is how is it that something which is either unlawful or in some cases specifically illegal in planning law can then be rendered lawful by other considerations. If a property developer were to purchase the field and seek to build a mansion, there would be rigorous enforcement against them. If a developer were to seek to build family homes or a care home, there would be rigorous enforcement against them. And therefore the question rightly is asked is why is it that other elements of our law would allow the statutory planning process and rules to be bypassed for one individual, and especially when that site may then be subsequently sold on to another occupier, how can we ensure that this is not simply a backdoor by which the planning rules can be flouted? I have to say, I have personal experience of a developer who cited diplomatic immunity as a reason why the local authority could not carry out enforcement action against structures built on agricultural land. And combined with the enormous remediation cost that is associated with abuses of this planning process, it's not surprising that many local authorities remain extremely concerned about the impact. And as the member for Wychavon, with his particular experience as a local authority leader as well, and brought to bear in his contribution to the debate, we can all think of examples of where it may not be a housing development that takes place through illegal occupation. It may, for example, be used for waste disposal. And I know Buckinghamshire County Council, on the borders of my constituency, faced multi-million-pound costs to deal with the clean-up of a site that was purchased by a group, in this case a group of travellers, from a farmer, who then used it to dispose of asbestos and hazardous waste, which required enormous taxpayer cost to remove. And in all of these cases, there is a common issue, which is the local authority's inability to use very swift and robust enforcement powers. And we see, as the member for Thursk and Malton described, in effect, once the site is occupied and the use becomes established, it is very, very difficult to change that in a way that the community would expect. And I had the experience during our recent general election of delivering leaflets to properties that form part of an illegal encampment, because they've been there so long that the individuals are on the electoral roll. And clearly other residents in that community ask the question, how is it that all of these processes, which are designed to make sure that everyone follows the law, can come together in this way that seems to flout some of those rules? So on behalf of the official opposition, I would like to extend an offer to the Minister. I know he's taken an incredibly constructive approach to all of the issues within his portfolio. And it seems that members across all sides of this debate have made very constructive contributions about ideas as to how we could address the broad sweep of concerns that arise from this debate in a way that is more effective. Constituents of mine affected by an unauthorised encampment in the HoC's back have expressed great frustration that a local authority planning notice that applies to the site has effectively been bypassed by the individuals moving to another part of the site. And those kind of things create a real public backlash, understandably, as to why people feel that the law is simply not working effectively on their side. And for local authorities to have to resort to Section 61 of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act to deal with illegal and unauthorised encampments which are causing a nuisance is one thing. But making sure that activity that can, by passage of time, simply become established, that needs to be dealt with in a different way. May I suggest to the Minister that as we work together on that, we also consider the operation of things like the specific planning conditions that apply in the national parks. So I know the member for Thursk and Malton has the North Yorkshire Moors and the Dales National Parks nearby. And it's common that there are specific planning conditions that can be applied in national parks that would not operate in other areas, such as conditions around the occupation of new homes by agricultural workers, which again provide scope for abuse of the planning system. Should, for example, a developer build the property purportedly for agricultural worker use and then say that they wish to convert it to become a holiday let or an extended family home. There is the wider issue of ancillary uses. We know that, again, as the member for Thursk and Malton referred to, when a piece of land is in the green belt, maybe has an agricultural designation, there are always opportunities for a prospective applicant to cite that they need a barn to enable them to carry on their farming business, that they need a sports pavilion because they hope to use the land for sporting activity. And all of these potentially create a situation where property footprint is then established, and in planning terms, conversion of that, lawfalisation, legalisation of that occupation follows later, to the dismay of local residents who then call into question their own sense of confidence in the effectiveness of the planning system. And in particular, the scope for a use to become established and then the property then to be sold on for a profit in a way that simply is not available at Dame Siobhan to developers who are seeking to work within the system remains a significant cause for concern. So, Dame Siobhan, may I thank all of the members. I thought it was a very balanced debate that brought in many different angles on the way in which this policy interacts with Gypsy, Roma, traveller and settled communities. And can I urge the Minister to make the best use possible of the expertise of members across the House in ensuring that as we move to that process of updating planning law, we have effective enforcement powers in place, and that all of our residents, all of our constituents can have confidence that they will be treated equally before the law in the way that Parliament expects to happen.
Thank you, Dame Siobhan. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and can I formally congratulate you on your honour? I've not had a chance to do so yet. I congratulate the right honourable gentleman, the member for Thurston Moulton, on securing this important debate, and I thank him for the characteristic clarity with which he made his case in opening it. I'd also like to thank Dame Siobhan, the honourable members for Edinburgh West, for Glastonbury and Somerton, for Bromsgrove, and my honourable friends, the members for Sheffield Hallam and Rugby, for their contributions. And lastly, can I thank the Minister for his thoughtful remarks and warmly welcome him to his place. I will certainly take away the specific points he raised, but more widely I look forward to working with him, as he said, on a constructive basis wherever possible. Dame Siobhan, I must make clear at the outset of my remarks that while I noted the specific case that the member for Thurston Moulton raised, and indeed other cases that have been raised today, I hope honourable members will appreciate that I'm unable to comment on individual plans or applications due to the quasi-judicial nature of the planning process and the potential decision-making role of the Deputy Prime Minister. What I therefore propose to do is to make some general comments about national planning policy as it relates to traveller sites, and specifically the role of local planning authorities, including in respect of enforcement within that national framework, addressing many of the points that have been raised today, and also recognising that this is an incredibly complex area of policy and law, particularly as it relates to individual cases. Turning first to national planning policy, Dame Siobhan, the Government's approach to traveller site provision is set out in the Planning Policy for Traveller Sites policy paper, which should be read in conjunction with the National Planning Policy Framework and has the same policy status as it. My honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Hallam, and others have raised a number of wider issues outside of the subject of this debate, but I'd like to reassure her that it is the Government's overarching aim to meet the housing and accommodation needs of all communities in our society, and we are committed to ensuring fair and equal treatment for travellers in a way that facilitates their traditional and nomadic way of life, while respecting the interests of the settled community. Now, the policy paper in question, Dame Siobhan, makes clear that local planning authorities should set pitch targets for gypsies and travellers to address the accommodation needs of traveller communities with their area, and specifically in reference to the points that have been made around human rights law. That is often engaged when a proposed development is closely linked to a particular person's interests. In the case of gypsy and traveller development, the right to respect private and family life under the HRC, and in relation to the rights of the child under the 1989 Act and the UN Convention of the Child, are often engaged. However, such considerations can be addressed by planning adequately for traveller pitches to meet needs, and that is ultimately through the local plan process. And I think it touches on a wider issue. Certainly in respect of the Right Honourable Gentleman's community, for example, the North Yorkshire emerging local plan is in its very early stages. We need to see local plans across the country come forward in short order. We want to achieve universal coverage, but we need to see those plans progress because they are the best way that local communities can shape developments in their area, although I noted the points made by the Honourable Lady in respect of funding, and also by my honourable friend from Rugby in terms of the concern, which I do recognise, that local planning authorities don't face sufficient consequences for failing to adequately plan for those pitches. It's a concern raised in other areas, and typically, as I'm sure he will know, the penalty for not having a local plan in place, for not adequately providing for sites, is that a local authority will leave itself open to speculative development or retrospective applications, but I appreciate that that doesn't address the specific challenges around this particular debate in the way it does with more conventional planning applications, if you like. That policy paper, Dame Siobhan, also states that local planning authorities should consider the existing level and local need for sites and the availability of alternative accommodation, amongst other relevant matters when considering planning applications for traveller sites. Now, I appreciate the specific case the Right Honourable Gentleman raised did not concern a greenbelt site, as far as I understand, but honourable members may find it useful if I provide some detail on the proposals we've set out in relation to traveller sites as part of our proposed reforms to the National Planning Policy Framework and other changes to the planning system. As honourable members are aware, we are consulting on a range of policy changes as part of that consultation to ensure that our planning system is fit for purpose, supports the right development in the right places, and is able to deliver on the government's growth agenda. They include changes to greenbelt policy to enable the targeted release of low-quality grey-belt land to meet unmet housing and other development needs. These policy proposals, will not compromise our environmental objectives or undermine the overall function and purpose of the greenbelt, but will support opportunities for development in areas of highest need and will deliver tangible benefits to local communities and nature through our golden rules. Now, we intend that these proposals will apply to address unmet need for traveller sites, and we're seeking views on how the policy will operate through the consultation. To be clear, this is a departure from current policy position on greenbelt set out in both the current NPPF and the Planning Policy for Traveller Sites policy paper, but we consider it better supports the development needs of our communities and contributes to sustainable growth. But we will consider all of these matters carefully and will finalise position after considering consultation responses and following targeted engagement with the key stakeholders, including specialist planning consultants, charities representing the interests of the traveller community and professionals working in this space. As part of wider changes to national planning policy, we will also consider how planning policy for traveller sites should be set out in the future, including which aspects need to form part of the suite of proposals for national development management policies, something that was introduced through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. Turning to the role of local planning authorities, Dame Siobhan, while government is responsible for setting the legislative and policy framework within which the planning system operates, including the National Planning Policy Framework and that planning policy document I referred to, it is for local planning authorities who know their communities best to prepare local development plans and make decisions in accordance with such adopted plans unless material considerations indicate otherwise. I hope honourable members will appreciate that when it comes to police enforcement of unauthorised encampments, that is a matter for the Home Office and not MHCLG, but I can certainly pass back some of the concerns that have been raised and the comments made to my colleagues in the Home Office. When it comes to enforcement more generally, local planning authorities do have a wide range of powers with strong penalties for non-compliance. These powers, as the honourable member mentioned, were strengthened by reforms in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, which were implemented earlier this year. These reforms included longer time limits for enforcement action and action to address a loophole with respective development, so there is only one opportunity to appeal. On the basis of these available powers, it is for local authorities to decide what, if any, action to take depending on the particular circumstances of each case. This would include intentional unauthorised development, which would be weighed by decision makers in the determination of planning applications and appeals, as I recall the Right Honourable Member mentioning. Ultimately, Dame Siobhan, though, it is for individual local planning authorities to determine what weight to afford to a relative consideration based on the circumstances of a particular case, rather than government mandating them to follow a particular course of action. Happy to give way.
I support potential revisions to enforcement powers to give perfect clarity about how that can happen in these circumstances. His last point is the point I really want to touch on. This is the point about intentional, unauthorised development. That currently forms part of planning law through a ministerial statement rather than being formally in the NPPF, but nevertheless that does apply. Is he saying that he's happy to maintain that situation? Or is that something he's going to look at again, because it's very important that does form part of planning policy? Otherwise, there'd be even fewer levers at the disposal of planning authorities to make sure this kind of development does not happen. The problem here is not planning policy, it's people who subvert the planning policy for their own devices, through other devices.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for that point. Let me answer him very directly. In reference to those national development management policies I touched upon earlier, we stated in the NPPF consultation that is still open, closed on the 24th of September, that we were committed to creating NDMPs to provide more certainty and consistency to decision-making in a range of areas. And as part of this, we will look at all existing national policies, including the existing policy in relation to unintentional authorised development as set out in that 2015 WMS. So I hope that gives him some reassurance that we are looking at that particular issue, and I do understand the particular issue he raises, as part of bringing forward those NDMPs. And those NDMPs will have to be consulted on, so honourable members across the chamber will have an opportunity to feed in as to whether we have got the policy right in any particular area. But in closing, Dame Siobhan, can I thank the right honourable gentleman once again for giving the House an opportunity to discuss these matters, and to other honourable members for taking part in the debate. I genuinely welcome and look forward to further engagement on this issue from members across the House. And in the interim, I'd encourage all honourable members with an interest in how national planning policy relates to travellers to respond to that consultation on a revised MPPF before the deadline on the 24th of September.
Kevin Hollinrake to wind up.
Thank you, Dame Siobhan, and I can thank the front benches for their excellent contributions, and generally the tone of the debate was very constructive, and I think we're all on the same page in terms of local planning authorities having a requirement or fulfilling their requirement to make sure suitable provision is made for people who live different lifestyles, nomadic lifestyles. For example, I thank honourable members for Sheffield Hallam for their points, and Rugby and Edinburgh West, very constructive points, and my honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove. And I think he touched on the key point here, is we cannot have a planning system where it's easier to apologise than ask permission. That is the point. It must be the case. If that is the case, then it creates chaos in the system. Everybody could play those rules, and there will be chaos in terms of planning applications, and wider society. It undermines faith in the system. That's the very point I want to make here. It cannot be, there is whatever the protected characteristics of certain communities, it cannot be in our society there is one law for one and another for another. It feeds the perception that we operate a two-tier society, and that cannot be right. Undermines the entire system. So I hope the Minister will look at two things: bolstering enforcement powers, as the Shadow Minister quite rightly said, that's something we should continue to look at, but also make it crystal clear, even clearer than it is today, that we're clear the fact that this planning application, the recommendation, was for approval, despite the fact the written ministerial statement from February 2019 said that intentional unauthorised development, that should be a material consideration in a planning application. Nevertheless, the planning officers recommended approval. I think that was totally wrong. I congratulate the planning committee, who still rejected the application, but that may well go to appeal. I would like the Minister, when he is looking at this, and I welcome the fact he's going to look at all the full context of this, but make it even clearer in planning policy that somebody who is guilty of intentional unauthorised development will never be given consent for that application when there is such a clear abuse of process, and that will not be tolerated. Thank you, Dame Siobhan.
The question is that this House has considered the adequacy of planning policy for travellers' site. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.